And with the B20 looking to pursue and secure investment and funding flows on the continent, Tavaziva Madzinga, CEO of Santam, took us through the role of insurers in boosting Africa's investment case.
Let me just start by saying the ideals of the G20 are around solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And so for us in the insurance sector, we believe we bring a lot to this equation, working together with governments and other businesses. And as you've said, weather is a big factor that is playing across our continent, not restricted only to our continent. And it's something certainly that is creating an immeasurable loss of life, significant economic losses that we have seen triple since the 1980s. And so our role in the insurance sector is really to provide a level of stability and to allow businesses and individuals to recover post some of these shocks. Our role goes beyond paying for losses and for claims. We also play a very fundamental role in the preventative aspects. And so we work with communities, weather detection systems, using geospatial data, working with municipalities, working with other organizations across the continent towards a preventative and risk management approach.
And does that work somewhat boost investor sentiment when looking into the continent, looking into South Africa?
In fact, to a large extent, if you think of your big infrastructure projects, whether they be energy, your big, really big infrastructure projects, they do require a level of certainty, particularly protection against weather, protection against political uncertainty. And so the complex insurance products that we're able to bring to bear, complex as they may be, would be able to give investors and capital a sense of stability towards, and also almost a sense of certainty of outcomes. And so they play a fundamental role as an underpin to a lot of the infrastructure development that is much needed across the continent.
And just talking about that and funding and attracting funding, there's always this perception that Africa is too risky to invest in, right? And I want to talk about the work, right, that insurers are doing to somewhat shift that perception.
So I think from an insurance perspective, I think the first thing to say is that the concept of insuring itself is about pooling risk,
yes,
right, and diversifying that risk across the world. And so what is quite ironic is that we're able to take insurance risk from Africa, package it, and then share it and diversify it across global insurers. That is the very foundation of what insurance is. And so insurance risk in Africa is no more riskier than in other parts of the world. I think a classic example for us here in South Africa is that we've often talked about, load shedding, protecting the grid. And most people will not be aware that grids have actually failed in other developed economies around the world. This has not happened in South Africa. And I think it speaks largely to the fact that there is need, and this has been a key theme of this conference, for cooperation across government, businesses, and more importantly, working with the communities at grassroots levels to provide solutions. So it's not just a solution that insurers on their own can bring. We must work collaboratively across that whole value chain.
And when it comes to the work, the collaborative work and the efforts in the move to that, there's always been concern around regulation and whether Africa is investor friendly when it comes to regulation, right? Maybe talk to us about some of those public-private partnerships in terms of working with the public sector and whether the public sector is coming to the party.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that, the regulatory environment across the continent is fragmented. I mean, we operate through Santam Alliance across 26 countries, and so we have a depth of understanding of operating across that level of complexity. But I think fundamentally, we have found success in working with governments and municipalities towards driving these public-private sector partnerships. And where they have worked, they've been very, very successful. And I think we now have test cases that we're then able to roll out across the region and then across the continent. But I think you are right that the regulatory environment does appear to be discouraging to some extent to investors. And I think to a large extent, it reduces your ability to operate seamlessly at scale across the entire continent. And so I think our ask to the governments is to reduce that regulatory burdens to allow the free flow of goods, of capital, and of people and resources and skills across the continent.
Before I let you go, I want you to talk us through some of the programs you have. I know there's a program running with municipalities, right, here in South Africa. Talk to us about the progress on that front and how that could be applied across the continent, especially when looking at South Africa and the state of our local municipalities.
And I think that's a very good point. So what we bring to the table is tremendous expertise around mapping weather, around understanding the impact of floods. And so we're able to share a lot of that data and that analytics with municipalities. For example, just a very clear understanding of where buildings should go or should not go up. Right? Are we building in the way of rivers and floodways? So even though rivers haven't flowed, it can happen over 100 years. And so us being able to share that information with the municipality is certainly very useful. And then across the continent around town planning, I think those are aspects where we can certainly come to bear. And so I think our first objective as insurers is, as I've said, not to come in where the claims need to be paid. We would like to see the flood avoided by buildings going up in the right places and not where we expect floods. We would like to see the house not go on fire by putting in preventative measures against fires. And so I think that cooperation between us and local governments and governments across the continent can go a long way to protecting what we view as some of the most vulnerable communities across the continent that are unable to recover once they experience a shock, once they experience drought. These are the vulnerable communities that we can work together with government to protect and to enable the livelihoods of Africans across the continent.
And that's very important, Tava, considering that there's been questions around the importance of G20, B20, and how they affect the person at home, that's not necessarily at this level. So it's also very important to know how these things then eventually filter through to the ordinary South African.
And so I think it's important to say that we must not underestimate, as you pointed out, where legislation plays a role, where government plays a role, and where we as business bring capital, analytics, expertise that can fundamentally shift what is happening right down to the grassroots. And so I think for us across the African continent, there is a need for very strong institutions, right, working collaboratively. Because I think when you're sitting at the grassroots level, you're facing a drought, your cows are dying, your crops are not growing, where do you turn to, right? And so I think what we're saying is that we have solutions that can penetrate and reach that far down, but we must be able to do it collaboratively.
That was Tavaziva Madzinga, CEO of Santam.